We're gonna wait maybe just a few seconds while folks are still joining, and then we'll be in our webinar. All right, why don't we get started? Thank you all for joining us. This is our Center for Environmental Health Equity workshop series. This is one of a number of different webinars that we've been hosting to cover topics that we've heard from some of our tribal and community partners in our EPA Region 10, who are working on a diversity of different environmental and energy related projects. And we're always interested in hosting speakers who could kind of speak to the needs that are out there. And one of those needs that we've heard about recently has been a lot of interest in survey design and survey administration. And we are very fortunate to have one of the world's leading experts in that topic with us at our Center for Environmental Health Equity. And our speaker today is Stephanie Farquhar. Stephanie is a professor and the associate dean at the UW School of Public Health in the Department of Health, Systems, and Population Health. She draws from community-based participatory research principles to address social and environmental equity and works in close partnership with community organizations and agencies. When she's not doing this, Stephanie is running long distances and parenting her teen son and Doodle dog. Golden Doodle dog. Um, um, I think before we launch into Stephanie's presentation, we have another slide that I'm going to hand over to my colleagues on the outreach and engagement team, Leah and Allison, to tell us a little bit more about our center.
Thank you. Next slide. So as Edmund mentioned, we are the Center for Environmental Health Equity, and we're housed at the University of Washington. My name is Leah Wood. I'm the Community Outreach Manager. And Allison, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Hello, I'm Allison Hirata, and I'm the Tribal Outreach Manager.
Awesome. So as Edmund mentioned, we are an EPA-funded Region 10 Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center. And really what that is we work with community-based organizations and tribes around our region when it comes to developing environmental and energy projects. And we're here to act as a free resource for y'all, whether it is things like designing a project, coming up with ideas. We offer sort of this menu of services. So we can help with things like facilitation, collaboration support, so identifying partners, developing sort of the ideas and the plan for a project, as well as thinking through some of the systems needed to implement. And then a lot of what we do really focuses on providing kind of content expertise and doing things like a literature review. And we also help when it comes to identifying potential funding sources and developing applications for those. So things like reviewing an application before you submit, or even just being there to be kind of a partner as you're thinking through your project ideas. So we kind of offer this as our menu of services. You're welcome to order off the menu, or something we always say is ask the kitchen if you have an idea that you don't see represented. We can often respond to different requests like that. There's a few different ways that you can reach us. You can see our email on the side of the screen here, as well as our phone number. And then we have a website that you can access through that QR code. Or I believe Allison is going to put it in the chat as well. So thanks, everyone. And I'll hand it back to you.
My turn. Excellent. Hi, everybody. I'll scoot back here. I am Stephanie Farquhar. Thanks, Edmund, for introducing me. It'd be great if my mom could be on to hear that I was the world-renowned expert in surveys. She would love that and want to know all about it. Uh, but I'm looking through the list of participants here who have hopped on, and I've been in Seattle and at University of Washington for about 10 years. And prior to that, I was in Portland, Oregon, and was in Michigan, working in Detroit. I was in North Carolina. So I see some of you representing those various geographies. So really great to have you join us today. So disclaimer, let's see if I can forward my slides here. So I'm the mom of a teenage boy. I think Edmund mentioned, and this morning he told me that I should add more color to these slides. So I apologize if you agree with him. But I wanted to talk about surveys in our time together. Surveys for our work in all sorts of forms can be immensely helpful, and they can be 5 minutes or 25 minutes or 55 minutes. They can be conducted over the phone or in person or online on email. They can be completed with adults or with kids or with teachers or with elected officials. So surveys are endlessly flexible depending on your information needs and your goals. So today, I feel like my job is to help you think about, whether surveys are the thing for you, the tool for you, and how you might approach and use them. So if I do my job, you should be able to, at the end of our time together, define what is and what is not a survey, create a set of questions that will gather the information that you and your organization or agency or tribal community needs to know in order to do your best work, identify who should be responding to your survey and who can actually answer your questions, and then choose how best to collect the information in the variety of ways that I talked about: mail, in person, etc. And I'm curious if, I think, there we go. If anybody else has other objectives in mind and reasons for hopping onto this webinar today, you can drop it into the chat. You can unmute yourself. Other objectives or what you want to hear about. All right, I'll start with our first objective, and that is defining what is a survey. So ask us as a group, what makes a survey a survey? And a survey is simply a structured set of questions that gathers some kind of information from a group of individuals that you usually have in mind that you think can answer your question, to better understand experiences or opinions or behaviors or choices or values or priorities, and to answer a big question that you or your team might have about your community or a program or service that you're providing, or a concern that you feel your community has and would like to prioritize. So I have an example up here on this slide of, this is from Public Health Seattle King County, which I worked at Public Health Seattle in King County, which is our local health department in Seattle, for a few years. And this is a survey that they conducted via phone. And the big overarching question that they were trying to answer is, how and when are firearms used unsafely in our community, so that the King County Regional Office of Gun Violence and Prevention can improve community safety. So good example of a survey. And I'm looking in the chat, cultural responsiveness and design. Okay, got it. If I don't get there, let me know that you feel like we didn't get there, and we'll try to get there. Great question, great topic, great objective. So when we name, and if you could kind of simultaneously think about what your big question is for your organization or your community or your neighborhood. When we name a big question, we're asking ourselves, what's the purpose for doing the survey? What are we trying to answer? And this really works best and is easiest on us as we're developing a survey if we're super specific and if the big question is really well defined, and ideally that big question can't simply be answered with a yes or a no, but is a little more complex than that. So as an example, one big question could be, are people able to access healthcare services? But that is big, not incredibly specific. I'm not sure who we would talk to. Would we talk to everyone? A question that might be better suited for a survey is, are older adults able to access injury or fall prevention services? Or are parents of young children able to access well child services? So knowing specifically what you don't know and what you need to know to do your best work is what we are trying to generate with our big question. And this will be your North Star. This will guide what specific questions you ask in your survey, who you will talk to, how long you'll have the survey open, what you'll do with the data, who you'll present it to. Will you present it to a neighborhood association, or will you present it to appointed officials? Will you present it to a health officer at the health department? Will you present it to your funders or include it in your grant proposal? So this is your North Star that you develop all of your survey details around. So I have one example here. What are our community's priority climate change concerns, and what can we do about them at a local level? So this is something that we could start to answer with the survey. And we may decide that we also need focus groups, or we may decide that we need to use photos to capture kind of visible evidence that something exists, or we may decide we want to look at newspaper articles to see how city council is talking about the community's priority climate change concerns. But it can be really helpful to start with a survey first. Let's see if you come up. Does somebody want to test out their big question? What's another example that you and your team are trying to answer using a survey? Anybody want to raise your hand or drop something into the chat just to test it out? And my team, do you see hands? I don't think I see hands.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. The question is, do you have a big question that your organization or agency or community or group of concerned citizens are trying to answer using a survey? What's your big question that you're trying to answer?
This is Ashley. I'll just, there's one that get dropped in the chat, so you can defer to them too. But I was just gonna say, we're trying to assess a group of young people about if they understand the Healthy Environmental for All Act and like the agencies that are involved with it, because they've gone through some training. So it's kind of like post.
Got it. Great example, Ashley. So a post to get a sense of what their knowledge is, their awareness, how they might use that new information. That's excellent. Was there a pre? Doesn't have to be. I'm just curious. Was there a pre-survey?
We did more verbal like check-ins with them, less of a survey. So we're kind of doing a closeout survey now.
Yep, totally fair. How is your health impacted by the built environment around you? Yeah, and then I would want to think about, with that one, Charlotte, I love that as a start. Think about how you might use the data. So I'm super pragmatic when it comes to collecting data. I never want to collect it just to collect it. I want to know exactly what I want to do with it so that I have a purpose that guides me. Also, as you very well know, we overburden communities with surveys. So I try to think about, do I really need to ask this again, or do I already have the information? And if I ask it, is the information I collect going to make a difference? So how is health impacted by the built environment around you? And then maybe kind of some follow-up. We'll use that data to inform allocations by Multnomah County. Excellent. Are you at the health department or Metro or? Just curious. And then I saw a hand raised, the health department. Great. Did I miss a hand?
Looks
This
like
is
Bessie.
easy.
Yeah, busy.
Easy. This is easy. Hey, so my question is, what days are you you being community members available to work at the Green Thumb Community Garden. That's
Yeah.
just as it's specific, but you know, that's what you had asked, what was one of the big questions. So that would be what I would be offering to community members so that we can get who wants to be involved, and then go from there, how often, and then how do we, and it's to support the sustainability small grant for 2025 to revitalize the space. That's what it's for. Thank you for letting me share.
Excellent. Thank you, VC. That's great. So what I heard is that you want to get a sense of how people want to be involved and what would make them want to be involved, what that would look like. You might also want to find out about what would make it difficult for them to be able to show up and help with the Green Thumb Community Garden. So I think what days are you available might be a question in your survey, but perhaps zoom out with your team and think about what else do you need to know in order to apply for funding for the sustainable, I think I missed what you called it. Maybe it's in the chat somewhere, but there might be other things that you want to find out about. What will make it easier for you to participate? When, how, what does that look like for you? So the great start. Alrighty. Anything big that I'm missing here? Okay. Thank you for jumping in like that. Any questions so far before we start talking about the actual survey questions? All right. So once you have that big question around how can we make this Green Thumb effort successful, or how does built environment affect how we allocate budget, then you want to think about, does the information already exist? Do we already know this? Or do we really need to do a survey? So like I said, I'm cautious about developing a survey or a set of focus group questions if I think we already have access to this information. If you do not, and if the information doesn't already exist, then think about creating a set of questions that is limited to the questions and responses that are needed to address your big question. So keep it simple, keep it focused, and just keep in mind that any extra questions that you drop into your survey will take extra time to complete the survey. It might jeopardize people finishing the survey, or jeopardize them even starting the survey. If they look at it and it's many, many pages, or scrolling through a computer screen, it's many, many pages on the computer screen. So start with the most important questions as you're developing your survey, and think about pushing those to the front of the survey in case you find that you actually have to end up cutting questions towards the end because it's getting too long. And I'll talk a little bit about piloting and practicing your survey to see how long, in fact, it is. I have certainly developed surveys where I thought this should take about 15 minutes, but when I test it out on a best friend or a student or a coworker, it ends up taking more than a half an hour. So that's really helpful to have that practice time built into your timeline. Start with simple questions. If you have very sensitive questions, move those towards the end until they've gotten comfortable with the survey, or they've gotten comfortable with you or whoever is asking them the questions. And then make sure, of course, that we use phrases and words that are understandable, and that are in the form that you want to share out with other people. Again, elected officials, neighbors, etc. When you are designing questions, provide a frame of reference. So rather than stating maybe, do you support, are you a consumer of public transportation? Or do you use public transportation? Maybe starting with, in the past couple of weeks, how often have you used it? Because it may be that you are a supporter of public transportation, but in the last couple of weeks, job situation has changed, or you moved, or circumstances are different. And if you want to know, as the survey designer, what's happened in the last couple of weeks at the beginning of winter, make sure and frame it with that kind of frame of of reference. And then keep the question simple. Sometimes we drop in really kind of convoluted, complicated questions that could be answered in a variety of ways. For example, do you care about your community and do you show up to neighborhood cleanups? Those are two different questions. They shouldn't be in the same item. So one question might be, do you care about or value your community? A separate question might be, do you show up to neighborhood cleanups? So I guess my message so far is to kind of keep it simple and really focused on what it is you're trying to answer. And I will also say that this, our half hour or 45 minutes together was really geared towards our community and tribal community partners. So if you have other questions about surveys that you want to ask me later or look me up on email, I'm happy to meet with you and talk through other questions that you might have about survey. If you've already made it through these first initial stages of thinking about your big question and developing a set of survey questions, I'm happy to meet and talk about your later stages of design. All right, so do we want numbers and percentages, or do we want words, or do we want both? Drop into the chat what you find most convincing. If somebody is trying to make an argument or make a point or convince you of something, do you prefer numbers and percentages? Do you prefer words and stories? Do you prefer both? What convinces you that something is a concern, a trend, an issue, a problem, an asset? So numbers and percentages or words. Leah and Allison, I'll let you kick us off. There we go. Stories are important first, then numbers, surveys, interviews. Anybody else feel strongly one way or the other? What do you use most in your work or with your community? Numbers and percentages or words and narratives and stories? So some people respond to or are moved by numbers, that kind of showing the magnitude or the breadth of the issue, and they need to see the numbers, especially around budget allocation, perhaps. But others are more moved by stories and photos. And I would say that if you're trying to change policy or convince decision makers of something, they tend to be moved by both. So if you are able to collect both, that's great. And my recommendation, whether you use closed or open-ended questions, and I'll give some examples of those, really think about having a very well-designed format that has some spacing, and think about your font type and the size, and make it really, really easy for anyone to read and access and complete the entire survey. Many community organizations and myself we might use REDCap or some other system for collecting data, but we also use Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. There's a variety of ways to collect information that isn't a huge lift in terms of putting your questions into that format. Does anybody out there have a favorite? If you've collected information and data, if you used Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, is there another one that we should let everybody on this Zoom call know about? Qualtrics.
Qualtrics.
Great, excellent. Yeah. Yeah, the beauty of that is you have the data immediately. You can start playing with it, cleaning it up, analyzing it. I've not heard of Survey 123. So here's an example of a closed-ended question. And a closed-ended question provides respondents with a fixed or a closed set of response options. And so, for example, application, let's see, my work did not get disrupted today due to this training. Agree, disagree, something somewhere in between. I will state that I'm not a huge fan of neutral or unsure. I try to use that sparingly if possible, because that tends to be the default response if people are ambivalent about choosing one or the other. If you have that middle category, that tends to be the one that gets selected a lot. So I don't use it very often, but that's an example of a closed-ended. And then some of you mentioned on in the chat, scales. So Likert scales can be used to provide ratings that assess anything, opinions, attitudes, behaviors, how often you eat, you name it. So here we could say, in a typical week, how often do you use public transportation? From almost always to never, or how concerned are members of your community about severe weather trends, extremely to not at all, etc. And then there are, if you're collecting information and you prefer not to use a number chart, there are other creative ways to get around this. And we use this sometimes not only with young kids, but also with teenagers. So, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, that looks like this. How was your weekend? Or for kids, looking at this chart, let me know how you feel about your first grade teacher. So there's all sorts of ways. In fact, Public Health Seattle King County uses this as a rating system for their what? Does anybody know? Anybody want to? I'm quizzing you now while I change the slide. Food safety. Yes. That's right. So an open-ended example is if you want to ask yourself, what do I want to know that can't really be quantified, or that you need to know a more nuanced response, or you want to know about process. So examples here are which topics covered were most relevant to your job. You could have a drop-down menu and have all sorts of options, but chances are it's not going to be completely exhaustive, or it's going to be such a long list that people are going to stop looking at the list and just select. So if you want more accurate data, this can be an open-ended example where you can write in text, can be a really useful way of collecting information. Okay, questions about closed versus open-ended, best practices that you want to share with us? Does anybody have best practices or specific questions? If you're thinking about it, others probably are as well. So, yeah, VC.
Thank you. Thank you. My question is, does it matter if the survey is long or short as far as being effective? I know sometimes when I'm taking a survey, if it goes past a certain amount of time, then if I don't have to take it, then I stop in the middle. So do you have any uh, uh, advice on if it should be short and then provide many times, or if it should be long and then you know, you get people who actually want to give the information? Thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, absolutely. I have lengths of time that I suggest, at least to my students, for surveys and focus groups and in-depth interviews. So focus groups and in-depth interviews where you're seated next to someone and doing more of a kind of a conversational style interview, not necessarily a survey. I always say absolute maximum 60 minutes, and then people are done. They're finished with the conversation. For a survey, because our attention spans have shortened, and because we're multitaskers, I try to keep it within 15 minutes. And the second part of that answer is, if people really care about the topic and they're committed to providing this information, they might go a bit over that, but that's kind of the tipping point in my experience of people being able and willing to complete a survey. Otherwise, you get blank answers towards the end. Yeah, so Chess said for each question, I usually recommend that the why behind the question is documented for downstream analysis. So are you suggesting then that if I asked, do you take public transportation? Or how often do you take public transportation? That I then ask why? Is that your
No, I'm saying for
suggestion?
sort of the person who's creating the survey, I like at the beginning you talked about like the big broad, what are you trying to answer, right? Um, and really for each question in the survey, it should be pointing back to that, right? And so
Oh, yeah.
sometimes saying, like what to your sort of public transportation, for example, what kind of public transportation? I think for that you could say we're trying to get an understanding of the types of public transportation for whatever analysis you want to do downstream, right? As it like relates to another question or as it relates to your actual purpose. So
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I always ask myself, why am I asking this? Is it absolutely essential in order to keep the survey short, focused, and to ensure or increase the likelihood that I'm collecting data that I actually need and not a bunch of extra stuff that I end up not using, data that I end up not using. Yep, that's great, Ashley. Thanks for the suggestion of kind of the preamble, I always call it, to the survey, explaining why you're collecting this information. Super helpful to get people to complete it. Okay, there are 4 general methods that we talk about for most efficient and effective way to get information from your group of potential respondents. And I'm curious if we don't have to talk about all 4, but are there 2 that you think you're most likely to use that we can spend a little bit of time on?
I'd be curious to hear about online and
Great.
I'm kind of like a combination of in-person or phone. I could go with whatever the crowd goes with.
Okay, great, Ashley. Let's hear from the crowd. What would the crowd like? Online and in person. Alrighty. Great. So I always ask myself which method of all modes of data collection, these are all valid and legitimate methods of data collection, but which one which one is going to get me the information most consistently and in the time frame and within the budget that I have allotted to this survey. So maybe I have a week and I have $100 for the survey. Maybe I have 6 months and I have $20,000 that I can spend to get the information. So that does help drive, or that does drive and influence the method that you choose, just realistically. So the thinking about your question and who you're going to be asking is critically important. If you are thinking about an online survey, but you think that the folks that you want to get information from and to learn more about aren't online, then that's probably not a great option for you. If you think the people that you want to talk to and you want to have complete a survey aren't answering their phones or picking up their phones when it rings, then that's probably not a great option. If your kind of universe of people that you want to talk to are spread out across the United States, then in person is probably not the best method for you for obvious reasons. So what I like about online, and it took me a long time to come around to this, I'm definitely more old school where I think in person has sort of the human element. It allows for in-person and in-depth conversation, allows us to build trust. It allows us to share a little bit more about what it is we're trying to do when we're meeting in person, but it can also be hugely expensive and a time sink, depending on how many people you're trying to reach. So in person is best for smaller, sort of more geographically focused surveys where you maybe already have a reputation or relationship with the neighborhood or the community or members of an organization or a coalition. That could be your best method. But if you're going in cold, that's a really difficult one to have people want to speak with you online, or excuse me, in person. Another option is standing somewhere and doing what we call intercept surveys. So I'm standing in front of a grocery store, and when people walk through, I'm asking them about their kind of food purchasing behavior or something that might be related to that particular setting, or they're coming into the library. I'm asking how they're using that space and if they would like to have another community center that would allow for more interaction and community activities and gathering spaces. So that kind of an intercept convenience survey in person is just fine because you're not knocking on doors. And that might be the best way to get people who are, patrons of that particular location or site. And then online is can be incredibly efficient, and it's easier to get the questions answered in a shorter period of time. So if you think about scrolling really quickly through that slide that I showed with the closed-ended surveys, you could click on agree or disagree within literally seconds. If I were sitting in front of you or on a phone asking you those same questions, it could take 5 times as long to get the same amount of responses. So online is really fast, it's super cost effective, and it has a potential for expanded reach because you're not limited by geography and budget, and other sort of resources. That said, some people are really skeptical of clicking on a link, especially now, worried that it will take them to some faraway place. And so online, you have to think about your time, your audience, and whether or not people trust that mode of survey design. Anything else that people want to add from their experience?
Hi, sorry, I can't change my name, and also I'm sick, so I'm kind of horizontal, so I'm gonna keep my video off. But I have noticed that it's bots and like automated responses have been becoming an increasingly large problem, especially if your survey has incentives attached to it. So that's I've been dealing with more and more, which is really fun and awesome, and I'm being sarcastic.
I can hear that. I can hear, even though you're sick and you're horizontal, you still have a good sense of humor. So hold on to that. Yes, that can be very difficult. There are all sorts of things that can pop in, ads that can pop up as well, depending on the system that you're using when you're trying to issue an online survey. And it can be difficult to, if you do have incentives, it can be difficult to distribute incentives as well that way. Thank you, Survey Coalition.
Bethany, we also have someone shared in the chat, assuming people read their emails, sometimes our team has to follow up on a closed group chat or one-on-one to get that trusted survey messenger note to take the survey out.
Yes. When you send a survey, I think I'm understanding, Ashley, send it from a person rather than he. Send it from Leah or Allison or Edmund rather than the Center for Environmental Health Equity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, snowball dissemination. So that is if I know Leah, so I ask Leah, and I think this is what you're referring to, Survey Coalition. I ask Leah to complete the survey, and then Leah has other colleagues, coworkers, friends who are also interested in public transportation. So Leah asks a couple of her colleagues, friends, coworkers, and then they ask some of their colleagues, friends, and coworkers, and that's called a snowball sampling technique that can also be really efficient. There are some potential inherent biases to that because it's really all stemming on who I know and then who Leah knows, etc. So it might be kind of a closed insular group, but that's one way to collect surveys quite quickly. And then there's already trust because people trust Leah, and then Leah's friends will be trusted, etc. Okay, so identifying survey participants. Ask yourself who can answer our question, and it's not always quite as straightforward as you might think. So think about, is there a particular age, geography, occupation, ability, disability, experience, condition, diagnosis, proximity to industry or a highway. So thinking about who you want to get the information from is really important. And I always recommend establishing a system to track everyone that you sent the survey out to get to track all responses, because you want to know who responded, but you also wanted to know who refused, who partially completed the survey, who didn't respond, because you also want to know, is there a difference between those who immediately completed my survey and those who said, no, thank you, I'd rather not. I don't trust you. I don't know what you're up to. If, for example, only people over 45 responded and nobody under 45 responded, or they ignored your call for survey response, then you probably want to see if there's a different way to talk to those under 45 so that you have a sample or, you know, a group that represents who you're trying to reach. Does that make sense? So I track who responds and who doesn't. And we might do the same. I think there's some sort of evaluation after this. It'll be interesting to see. I don't know if we track names, but how many people respond, and if they don't respond, you know, what do we read into it? In this case, probably nothing. But that is useful information when you're doing a survey for a community or an agency or an organization or a tribal community. And then this idea of should it be random or should it be purposive, or I say purposive. So do I want to intentionally reach out to those who have middle school aged kids, or do I just want to randomly select from the universe of potential respondents? How many of you have done purposive sampling where you knew who you wanted to talk to and you started with them, started reaching out with them? And who's done random sampling? And what did that look like? Let's use one of the examples that was dropped in around the built environment. Let's see. Yeah, so for KDNA, you do purposeful sampling for the grants. So you know who you want to talk to and you approach them and ask them to complete a survey. That's great, thank you. And then random would be, I know everybody in my class. I have a class of 150 students, and I randomly select 10 of them by putting all of their numbers, scatter their numbers or ID numbers, and just select 10 of them from the random group, randomized group. Allison.
Oh, I was just gonna say there's a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw it, from Ashley. Is there survey literature out there that shows trends for under 25 or 26-year-olds? Not
So yeah, thanks, Allison. That shows trends for response rates, or that shows health trends?
I think I was just thinking about, like, you know, you look at polling that they've been doing and just seeing where people like from the younger audiences are getting news, for instance, and it's like vastly different across the generational kind of spectrum. So I was kind of wondering in regards to like their interactions with surveys and what type of surveys they respond to and that kind of thing.
Yeah, those tend to be honestly online for a younger audience. But if you want to follow up with me, I can kind of pick through the literature and see if I can find something specific for you. But that's my experience.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is basically one of my final slides. And I need to wrap up when now?
Whenever you'd like, Stephanie. So we just have time for questions after this.
Okay. So pilot testing, we pre-test the survey before we take it on the road so that we can see if people understand the questions, if the response options that we provide to them are clear. And so we get a sense of the real time, not the imagined time that it takes to complete the survey. And there's a thing called cognitive interviewing, which is really, I read my question to you and then I ask you, does it make sense? Is it confusing? Is it too sensitive? Do you think people will answer it? You know, this, and then you give me feedback on my survey questions and my length of my survey and the way I ask the questions. which is super, super helpful, because sometimes we get so close to our questions that we can't tell that they're either not very strong or they're not very clear, so forth. Alan, if you ask for, if you let me know what specifically you would like, for sure, I can pull together some articles and send them to you. I have lots and lots. I would just want to make sure it was relevant for you. Yeah. And then finally, just thinking about after you pilot test and you're ready to, and you know who you're going to ask questions of, and you know what your questions are, and you know what you're trying to answer, and you know what you want to do with the information. I like to do one last check and think about ethical considerations and potential burden on community. So for example, most of us know that it needs to be confidential and that we shouldn't share names or information on the folks that we talk to, but there are also other steps that we can take. For example, including them in the conversation around how will we disseminate the information, and will we share it so that if I were to survey everybody on this call, I would mix all of our numbers up, aggregate it, and send it out as a single number without people knowing it came from Stephanie or Allison or Edmund or Kevin. So that is a really important consideration. I'm wondering if you have other ideas or experiences on ethical considerations and burden on community when doing surveys. Feel free to unmute or drop into the chat what those ethical considerations might be, or where you want to advise us to tread lightly and be thoughtful.
I'm just gonna speak as a community member. I know for me, like I take surveys a lot, but I have kind of like someone else suggested, I think they had to jump off, have refused to fill out surveys because the information has already been asked like a bunch of times and kind of like, why are you asking me this? There's like reports online that you can like read about our community about this. Like you have to really like give me a strong reason about like why I need to give the same, like kind of like, is this an academic exercise for you, or is it actually going to go to something that's going to make change in our community?
Yep. Very, very well said. I won't even try to summarize that. That's excellent. Thank you. Anyone else? Ethical considerations, things you want us to keep in mind as we're developing surveys, thinking about who to interview or survey? One thing that I try to do in my practice is I do like a town hall, or what we call, has a number of different names. One is like a community feedback opportunity where if I were to gather information from this group about what your environmental or energy justice priorities or work looked like, I would want to maybe bring that back to you and ask you if I got it right, if it feels accurate, if I think I'm missing something big. If you think we asked the wrong questions, that's really helpful to do that additional check to make sure that I am accurately representing your own feelings, experiences, and values in my summary of what's essentially your data. So that's a good best practice. And we have some time for questions. I'd love to hear what they are. See as a group we can answer these together. If you were to develop your survey today after you hang up on this Zoom, think about what you wished somebody had asked, where to start, what your first question might be. Or ask something that we didn't touch on.
I think someone had asked earlier about culturally responsive approaches to surveying.
Yeah. I would love to hear I'd love to hear more about that question. To make sure that how I'm interpreting culturally responsive is aligned with your question. I'm looking back to find it. Does anybody want to share what they were thinking? Otherwise, I'll just jump in.
When I heard
Looks
that
like the
question,
sorry, I was just gonna say, looks like the person who asked that question has signed off, so that's why we're not
Okay.
hearing it. Sorry,
Okay.
Edmund, go ahead.
I was just gonna, the first thing that came to my mind is, oftentimes it's very limiting to only have survey responses in English. It's done out of convenience rather than a best practice. And so I think that's one way to be more culturally inclusive is to offer multiple languages.
Yeah, absolutely, Edmund. And also that is the critical, that is one of many, many, many reasons why I really advocate for community partnered work in all forms. I shouldn't be the only one developing a survey if it's not with those who live in my original hometown of Longview, Washington, for example. I could probably design a pretty culturally relevant survey for Longview, Washington. But if I'm developing it for another community or another group or another neighborhood, I really want them to be very involved in helping to even think about what is the big question. So involving people early and often who are part of the community, and also pilot testing. So a question that you think makes complete sense to you may be overly sensitive or intrusive to somebody else. Eleni?
Yeah, I'm Ilani, and I just wanted
Ilani,
to
sorry.
yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to add about the cultural responsibility is I'm an enrolled tribal member of the Tlingit Nation. And so what is really valuable is to have people who, if they want to know about our various communities, because there's something like over 474 federally recognized tribes, 29 of them are in Washington state, and then over 500 nations come through Seattle, King County area, and including First Nations, which is, and also Hawaiian First Nation folks too, besides the Canadians as well. And so what is helpful is to make sure you have culturally relevant questions and someone who would design the survey who would be of that culture. That would be really valuable. So that and someone who knows some of the history, because you'd be surprised how many questions I get that a question could be in one sentence, which literally could take me an entire hour to answer because they don't know or understand our culture and history because it's been totally erased from the history. And I actually give workshops on how to be an ally to Indigenous people. It's called Building Bridges Between People, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there, including all of the history's been practically erased. And so especially with this, the current things that are happening out of the administration, they're also cutting all many of the funding, a very important funding that was signed in the treaties that are supposed to be guaranteed to our people, and also understanding there's urban Indians and there's reservation Indians and reservation Indians who are off reservation. So it's very complicated. So I just wanted to add that 2 cents there.
Yes. Thank you, Ilani, for putting an exclamation point on that. Absolutely. I really appreciate it. I think, and if you want to drop into the chat the partnership that you just mentioned, that would be fabulous. I think I'm needing to hand it over to Allison and Leah again. So thank you all. Feel free to follow up with me. I realize I don't have my contact info in here, but others know how to find me. So
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you everyone for your participation. It's been really cool to see both like new and familiar names in the chat and asking questions. And we really appreciate you all coming out here today. Can I get the next slide, please? So Allison just put in the chat our own survey. So we are collecting information about like how we're doing as a center with these webinars, and we do hope to offer more in the future. So if you don't mind taking just a few minutes to fill out the survey in the chat, we would love that. We do look at every single response and it does inform what we do. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do so. It should take only a minute or two. This is a reminder about our center. We are here for you for any of your technical assistance needs. So feel free to reach out to us. Myself and Allison are the ones that check the requests that we get. So you'll hear from one of the two of us. These are the people behind the mask here. And then I wanted to extend a quick invite before folks hop off. Can I get the next slide, please? So we have another webinar coming up next month. So please save the date. This will be on best practices for environmental data collection, specifically around community air monitoring. And this will be featuring our very own Dr. Edmund Cito, who you've all heard from, who's going to be presenting on how you might think about community air monitoring for your community. So you can register for that webinar here using this QR code. I'll also send it out along with the slides and the recording from today's webinar, probably either tomorrow or later this week. And we hope that you can join us. Thank you all for your time. Edmund, any last words you want to share, or Stephanie?
Stephanie?
Yeah, I was answering Charlotte's message about a warm up. And yeah, I always try to allow a few minutes of, I mean, this is if it's in person or on phone, but a few minutes of just talking and answering any questions of concerns that people have. And always saying, if you don't want to answer one of our questions, please don't. And you always say, even if it's an electronic survey, put that right up front, that you don't have to answer every question. You can stop when you want to, that sort of thing. So people really know it is absolutely 100% voluntary.
Yeah, and I would just like to follow up. I mentioned at the beginning, we're always interested in topics for our webinar series, and we're hosting these every 1 to 2 months. And so if you sort of have a burning suggestion for a topic for us to cover, please let us know. The air monitoring is one that has come up in recent conversations over here, and so we're trying to respond to that need. And hope to see you all at our next webinar.
Thanks, Edmund. And Leah, somebody requested that we go back. Oh, Alani asked if we go back to the survey slide, I think, that has the link.
Yes.
Or you just dropped it in here, sorry.
Yeah, and I apologize. That QR code on the previous slide is for our website, not for the survey. So the link in the chat is the best option for folks who haven't seen that. And that's another great place to let us know what topics you're interested in too. So thank you all.